The letter fell from her fingers before she finished reading it. Adelaide Everett stood in the middle of the dusty street in Caldwell, Kansas, her chest heaving with the kind of pain that comes before a person fully understands they are destroyed. Around her, wagons rolled past, merchants called out prices, children chased a dog between the barrels of the general store, and not a single soul noticed that her entire world had just collapsed into the red dirt beneath her boots. She pressed her lips together hard, clamped her jaw, blinked rapidly against the burning that gathered behind her eyes. She would not cry here, not in the open, not where anyone could see. The letter was from her brother's lawyer. Her brother, Daniel, was dead. Had been dead for 3 weeks before anyone thought to inform her. And worse than the news of his death was the single paragraph that followed it, written in the clean, indifferent hand of a man who dealt in facts without feeling. The Everett Ranch, all 460 acres of it, the land their father had broken his back over, the land Adelaide had grown up running barefoot across, the land that was supposed to be hers and Daniel's equally under their father's will, had been signed over to a man named Gerald Holt 6 days before Daniel died. Signed over for a debt that Adelaide had never known existed. A debt that, according to the lawyer, was legally binding, properly witnessed, and entirely uncontestable. She had come to Caldwell to find answers. She had taken the stage from Abilene with nothing but her traveling trunk, $42 sewn into the lining of her coat, and the kind of stubborn determination that had kept the Everett family alive through drought and frost and cattle sickness for 20 years. She had told herself she would fight this. She had told herself she was strong enough. But standing there in the street with the letter at her feet and the Kansas sun beating down on her without mercy, Adelaide Everett pressed the back of her wrist against her mouth and tried with everything she had to keep the tears from falling. She was not entirely successful. She turned sharply toward the wall of the nearest building, facing the weathered planks, breathing in shallow pulls, her shoulders rigid with the effort of containing something too enormous to contain. And that was when she felt it, a warmth at her back, a presence. And then, without a word, without a question asked or an explanation offered, a broad hand settled gently on her shoulder, and she was turned carefully and pulled against a chest that smelled of leather and open air and honest work. She did not know him. She would not learn his name for another 4 minutes. But in that moment, in the middle of everything falling apart, Mason Sutton held a crying stranger together with nothing but his arms and his silence, and Adelaide Everett, for just a moment, let herself be held. What had brought them both to that exact point on that exact street was a story that had begun 6 months earlier, in a season of secrets, forced choices, and the particular kind of betrayal that only family can inflict. Adelaide had been living in Abilene, working as a seamstress and taking in laundry at a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Pearl Chambers. It was not the life she had imagined for herself, but it was honest, and it kept her fed, and she had constructed a careful, quiet routine around it that felt almost like peace. She had left the Everett Ranch 2 years prior, not willingly, but because staying had become impossible. After their father's death, Daniel had taken on a business partner, Gerald Holt, a man who arrived in their county with a flashy vest and city manners, and a way of talking that made everything sound reasonable until you examined it closely and found the rot underneath. Gerald Holt was the kind of man who smiled at women and then looked through them. He had looked through Adelaide from the first day he arrived, which she had taken for indifference until she realized it was something more deliberate. He wanted the ranch. He had always wanted the ranch. And Daniel, who loved his sister genuinely, but who was also 24 and reckless and easily flattered by a man who treated him like an equal, had let Gerald Holt in through the front door without once asking what he was carrying behind his back. Adelaide had argued. She had raised her concerns, clearly and calmly, and then less calmly, and finally with the kind of desperation that gets a woman called hysterical and unreasonable, and too emotional to be trusted with practical decisions. Daniel had listened with the expression of a man being patient with someone who did not understand the wider picture. Gerald Holt had watched her from across the table with small, satisfied eyes. She had left before she said something she could not take back, or before Gerald Holt found a reason to have her removed. She had packed her things and kissed her brother on the cheek and told him to be careful. He had told her she worried too much. She had told herself she would come back when things settled down. Things had not settled down. Daniel had died, apparently from a fever that took him fast, and the ranch was gone. And Adelaide had received the news the same way she had received every piece of bad news in her adult life, alone, in a rented room, with no one to absorb it with her. She had not let herself fall apart in Abilene. She had packed her trunk, informed Mrs. Chambers that she would be away for an indeterminate time, and boarded the stage to Caldwell, because Caldwell was where Gerald Holt operated out of, and Caldwell was where the lawyer's office was, and if there was any chance at all of contesting what had happened to her family's land, she would find it there. She had not planned for the letter to break her on the first day. Mason Sutton had been in Caldwell for a different set of reasons entirely, most of them practical, and a handful of them personal. He ran a cattle operation about 12 miles south of town, a spread called the Sutton Ranch that he had built himself over the past 8 years from a single quarter section of leased land and a borrowed start of 60 head. He was 31 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and hands that had not been clean of calluses since he was 15. He had grown up in Missouri on a hardscrabble farm that barely produced enough to feed a family of 7, and he had come west at 22 with nothing but his father's saddle and a talent for working harder than anyone expected him to. He had done well. Not wealthy, not by the standards of the big cattle barons who were beginning to press in from the north and east, but stable. Honest. He owned his land outright now, every acre, paid off 2 years prior after a particularly good season. He had a foreman he trusted, 3 permanent hands, a solid house he'd built with his own labor, and the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who knows exactly what he has and exactly what it cost him. What Mason did not have, and what he had not allowed himself to want for a very long time, was someone to share any of it with. He had come to Caldwell to settle an account at the feed store, purchase supplies, and attend to a legal matter of his own with an attorney named Farnsworth who handled deed registrations. He had not come to town looking for trouble or tenderness. He had come to town looking to be efficient and return home before dark. He was walking past the wall of the harness shop when he saw her. She was turned away, her back to the street, wearing a dark blue traveling dress that was slightly dusty at the hem from the road. Her posture was one of the most controlled things he had ever seen. Everything about her was held together with a deliberate rigidity that he recognized immediately, not because he had seen it in others, but because he had worn it himself, in the months after his father died, and his mother had needed someone steady, and he had not been able to afford the luxury of falling apart. She was not crying loudly. She was not making any sound at all. That was the thing that stopped him. The absolute silence of someone fighting very hard not to break. He did not think about it. He had learned early in his life that thinking too long about whether to help someone was just a way of talking yourself out of it. He crossed the distance between them in 4 steps, and he put his hand on her shoulder, and when she turned, startled and stiff with reflexive pride, he simply pulled her in and held on. She went rigid for exactly 2 seconds. Then something gave way in her quietly, like a knot being worked loose, and she pressed her face against his chest, and the tears came properly then, in the silent, shuddering way of someone who has been holding them back for a very long time. Mason said nothing. There was nothing to say. He did not know her name or her circumstances, or what had happened to bring her to this exact point of breaking. He only knew that she was alone and in pain in the middle of a busy street, and that sometimes the only honest response to that was exactly what he was doing. After perhaps 3 minutes, she pulled back. She straightened, set her shoulders, and looked up at him with green eyes that were red-rimmed but fierce with the particular pride of a woman who has just allowed herself a vulnerability she did not intend. She swiped quickly at her face with the back of her hand. "I apologize," she said. Her voice was steadier than he expected. "That was entirely inappropriate. I don't know you." "No harm done," Mason said. "Are you all right?" She looked at him for a moment with the assessment of someone trying to decide something. Then she bent down and picked up the letter from the street, folded it carefully, and tucked it into the small bag she carried at her wrist. "I will be," she said. "Eventually." He believed her, which was interesting. Most people, when they said things like that, sounded like they were trying to convince themselves. She sounded like she was stating a timeline. "Mason Sutton," he said, and extended his hand. She shook it with a firm grip that surprised him. "Adelaide Everett, you're new to Caldwell. I arrived on the morning stage." She glanced up the street, then back at him. "I need to find an attorney named Forsyth. Do you know where his office is?" "Farnsworth," Mason said. She blinked. "What? There's no Forsyth in Caldwell." "The attorney here is named Farnsworth, James Farnsworth. His office is on the 2nd floor above the bank." Adelaide stared at him. "The letter I received gave the name Forsyth." Mason considered this. "Where was the letter sent from?" "The Everett Ranch. Outside Caldwell." "From a man claiming to represent my brother's estate." She watched him and something in her expression sharpened. "That's significant, isn't it?" "I don't know," Mason said honestly. "It might be a mistake. It might be something else. But there's no attorney named Forsyth anywhere in this county." He paused. "Do you know a man named Gerald Holt?" The change in her face was immediate and unambiguous. "Yes," she said very carefully. "Why do you know that name?" "Because he approached me twice in the past year about buying my land," Mason said. "And both times the deal he proposed had terms in it that would have left me holding nothing inside of 18 months. He operates out of Caldwell. He has a silent partner in the land recording office, and there's been talk." He stopped himself. "Forgive me. I'm giving you information you didn't ask for, and I don't know your situation." "My situation," Adelaide said, "is that Gerald Holt has taken my family's ranch through a debt agreement my brother apparently signed before he died. And the attorney who sent me this letter apparently does not exist, which suggests that the letter was designed to make me believe legal options are unavailable to me when they may not be." She said all of this in the same even, precise tone, but her jaw was tight and her green eyes were very bright, and Mason could see that underneath the composure she was burning. "Then you need a real attorney," Mason said. "James Farnsworth is honest. I've dealt with him for 8 years. He'll tell you what the actual legal situation is." "Will you take me to him?" Adelaide asked. It was not hesitant. It was direct and a little imperious, the request of a woman who knew the value of asking for exactly what she needed. Mason looked at her for a moment. He had come to town for feed and a deed registration. He thought about his foreman, Caleb, waiting back at the ranch with a fence line that needed attention and a restless group of steers that were new to the operation. He thought about the efficient afternoon he had planned. "Yes," he said. Come on." James Farnsworth was a thin man with wire spectacles and the permanently skeptical expression of someone who had spent decades watching people behave badly. He listened to Adelaide's account with his hands folded on his desk, and his eyes focused somewhere slightly above her head in the way of people who are filing information carefully as they receive it. When she finished, he took off his spectacles, polished them with a small cloth, and put them back on. "There is no Forsyth registered in this county or the two adjacent," he confirmed. "The letter you received was written to deceive you about your legal options." He paused. "Now, the deed transfer itself is a separate matter. If it was properly executed and witnessed, it creates a legitimate legal instrument regardless of how you were subsequently misled." "Can it be challenged?" Adelaide asked. Farnsworth tapped his desk slowly. "Possibly. It depends on the circumstances of your brother's death, the nature of the debt, and whether the agreement was obtained under any form of duress or misrepresentation. If Gerald Holt or anyone acting on his behalf misled your brother about the nature of what he was signing, or if the debt itself was manufactured, then there is a basis for challenge." He looked at her directly. "But I will tell you plainly that Gerald Holt has resources and connections in this county that make such a challenge difficult, not impossible, difficult." Adelaide met his gaze without flinching. "I understand difficult. What do you need from me?" Mason sat in the corner of Farnsworth's office through all of this, having declined the attorney's suggestion that he wait outside, partly because Adelaide had looked briefly at him with the expression of someone who would prefer not to be left alone in a strange room with a strange man, and partly because he was, against his own expectations, genuinely invested in what happened next. He watched her in that office the way you watch someone under pressure, looking for the places where the composure cracked or held. It held. She answered Farnsworth's questions clearly and completely. She had a remarkable memory, citing dates and amounts and specifics with an exactness that clearly impressed the attorney. She had brought documents, copies she had kept in her trunk of things related to the ranch and her father's will. She had not come to Caldwell unprepared. She had come to Caldwell ready to fight, and the letter that had broken her in the street had been a blow to a person already braced for impact, not a person who had not seen it coming. By the time they left Farnsworth's office, the afternoon light was going gold and the street had grown quieter. Farnsworth had agreed to begin a preliminary review of the deed transfer and to send inquiries to the county land office. He had also gently suggested that Adelaide obtain lodging in Caldwell for at least several weeks, as the process was unlikely to be fast. On the landing outside the office door, Adelaide stopped and stood still for a moment. She was looking at the street below, and Mason could see the slight stiffening in her shoulders again, the controlled effort of someone recalculating. "You have lodging arranged?" he asked. "No," she said. "I came directly from the stage. There's a decent boarding house on Maple Street run by a woman named Hannah Briggs. Clean, safe, reasonable rates. She does not take male boarders, which given your situation may be a relevant consideration." Adelaide looked at him sideways. "You seem to know this town very well for someone who doesn't live in it." "I come in once a week for supplies. I've been doing it for 8 years. You pick things up." "Fair enough." She was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Sutton, I'm aware that you've spent the last several hours helping a complete stranger with no particular obligation to do so. I want you to know that I am not someone who takes assistance for granted, and I intend to repay the time you've given me." Mason shook his head. "No repayment necessary." "I disagree," she said firmly. "I am not in the habit of being in debt to people." He almost said something about how odd it was that she used that exact word given her circumstances. He stopped himself. "All right," he said instead. If it matters to you, you can repay me by letting me know how things turn out with Farnsworth. That's not equivalent compensation. I don't need equivalent compensation. I need to know how it turns out. She studied him again with that direct, assessing look. Why? He was honest, because he had found over the years that it saved everyone time. Because Gerald Holt has been a problem in this county for a while, and if there's a legal case being built against him, I'd like to know about it. And because, he paused, I'd like to know that you're all right. Something shifted in her face at that, not softening exactly, more like the recognition of something unexpected. I see, she said. And then, with no further elaboration, she turned and walked toward the steps. I'll find Hannah Briggs' boarding house myself. I'm quite capable of navigating a street. I don't doubt it, Mason said. He stood on the landing and watched her go, and he noticed that she walked with the same deliberate erectness she had worn through everything else, and that it suited her, and that he was going to be thinking about Adelaide Everett for considerably longer than was practical. He returned to his ranch that evening later than he intended, arriving after dark to find Caleb, his foreman, sitting on the porch with a coffee cup and the settled expression of a man who is not surprised that things took longer than planned. Caleb Wright had been with Mason for 5 years. He was 43, lanky, weathered to the specific toughness of a man who had worked cattle on the open plains through several varieties of hardship. And he was the kind of person who said very little but heard everything. He looked at Mason when he rode in and did not ask any questions, which was his way of indicating that questions were available if wanted. Mason unsaddled his horse, rubbed her down, gave her water, and by the time he crossed back to the house, he had decided that there was no particular reason to bring up the afternoon in Caldwell. You look like a man who had a more complicated day than he planned, Caleb said. Feed's coming Thursday, Mason said, and went inside. He lay awake for a while that night listening to the wind move through the grass outside his window, and he thought about a woman with red-rimmed green eyes who had straightened her spine and asked to see an attorney and shaken his hand with a firm grip. He thought about the kind of strength it took to absorb that kind of news and immediately start planning a response. He thought about Gerald Holt and the dark satisfaction of a man who had been acquiring other people's desperation for profit. And he thought about the Everett ranch that he had heard mentioned before, a good piece of land south of the county line. He made a decision before he fell asleep that he only partly admitted to himself. He would go back to Caldwell on Thursday when the feed came. He would check on the legal situation. He would see if Adelaide Everett needed anything that he was in a position to provide. This was, he told himself, primarily about Gerald Holt and the broader problem of land fraud in the county. He was not entirely honest with himself about this, but it was close enough to function as a reason. Adelaide spent her first 3 days in Caldwell, doing what she had always done when the world was not cooperating with her plans, which was work. She wrote letters to every person she could think of who might have information about the circumstances of Daniel's death or the debt agreement Gerald Holt had produced. She wrote to the doctor in their county who had treated her brother. She wrote to 2 neighboring ranchers who had known their father. She wrote to the minister at the church the Everett family had attended. She visited the land recording office herself and politely, but firmly requested to see the deed transfer document, and was told twice that the records were not available for public inspection, which was not legally accurate in the state of Kansas, and which she noted carefully for Farnsworth. She also, with the particular economy of a woman who had learned to manage money carefully, spent the minimum necessary at Hannah Briggs' boarding house while calculating how long her $42 would last, and what she would need to do to extend her stay if the legal process stretched beyond a month. She found Hannah Briggs herself to be an unexpected comfort. The woman was 52, widowed young, and had run her boarding house for 15 years with a combination of strict house rules and genuine warmth that Adelaide found enormously reassuring. On Adelaide's second evening there, Hannah had set a cup of strong tea in front of her without being asked and sat down across from her at the kitchen table and said, with the directness of someone who had seen enough trouble not to require an introduction, "You're fighting someone with more money than you. That means you're going to need to be twice as smart and twice as persistent. Are you?" "Yes," Adelaide said. Hannah nodded. "Good. Then you'll manage." On Thursday, Mason Sutton came to town for his feed delivery and walked to Hannah Briggs' boarding house and knocked on the front door. Hannah answered it, looked at him with the evaluation of a woman who had been deciding for 15 years whether men were trustworthy, and after a moment said she would tell Miss Everett she had a visitor. Adelaide came down the stairs with the expression of someone who had known he would come back but had not allowed herself to assume it. She stood in the front parlor with her hands folded and her head slightly tilted. "Mr. Sutton, Miss Everett, I wanted to check on your progress." He held his hat in his hands, which she noticed. It was a minor thing, the gesture of a man who paid attention to basic courtesies. "And I have some information that may be relevant to your case." She led him to the parlor chairs, and Hannah Briggs disappeared in the direction of the kitchen with the courtesy of a woman who understood the difference between supervision and eavesdropping. Mason told her what he had learned. He had spoken to 2 other ranchers in the county, men he had known for years, and had discovered that Gerald Holt had approached both of them with the same pattern of dealing. A partnership offered, a debt accumulated, a transfer of deed executed at a moment of vulnerability. In one case, the rancher had signed under the impression that the debt agreement was temporary, a bridge until next season's cattle money came in. Holt had represented it as informal and personal. The document had been neither. "That's a pattern," Adelaide said immediately. "A deliberate pattern. Which means there may be a basis not just for my case but for a broader legal action." "That's what I thought," Mason said. "Farnsworth needs to know about the others." "Will they testify?" He was quiet for a moment. "Tom Ellery will. He lost his land entirely, and he's been furious about it for 2 years, and hasn't known what to do with the fury. Pete Garland is less certain. He still has his land because he caught on before he signed the final transfer, but he's got a wife and 4 children, and he's nervous about retaliation." Adelaide thought about this carefully. Farnsworth may be able to structure a filing that limits Garland's exposure. If he can submit his account as supporting evidence without being a named plaintiff, that may be enough. She looked at Mason. "How do you know these men well enough to have this conversation with them?" "I've been ranching in this county for 8 years, he said. "You know people. You also knew Gerald Holt had approached you twice about your land and you turned him down both times. Why?" "Because the terms were designed to fail," Mason said simply. "And because I've seen what happens to men who let someone else hold paper on their land." Something in his voice when he said that last part made her look at him more carefully. There was a personal weight behind it. She did not ask about it then. She stored it away with the same methodical attention she gave to everything that might matter. "I'm going to Farnsworth this afternoon," she said. "Will you come with me?" He came. The meeting with Farnsworth lasted 2 hours and resulted in an expanded strategy. Farnsworth was cautiously optimistic in the particular way of honest lawyers who have learned not to promise what the law sometimes refuses to deliver. He believed there was a viable fraud case, especially if Tom Ellery was willing to add his account. The fake attorney in the letter was itself potentially actionable, and the denied access to public land records was a procedural violation that could be used as leverage. The challenge, Farnsworth said, setting his spectacles on the desk and rubbing his eyes, is timing and money. A case like this takes months. Gerald Holt will hire the best attorney in Wichita, possibly Kansas City. His operation has been profitable long enough that he has significant resources. I have limited resources, Adelaide said steadily. I'm aware of that. What do I need to sustain the case legally? Farnsworth named a number. It was not enormous, but it was considerably more than $42 minus 3 weeks of boarding house fees. Adelaide nodded once, absorbing this without visible distress. I'll need to find work while I'm here. I can sew, I can teach, I can keep accounts. What is available in Caldwell? Farnsworth looked mildly surprised, which Adelaide interpreted as him having expected her to say something different. I believe the school teacher left in June. There may be a temporary position through the end of the year. I have a teaching certificate from the state of Kansas, Adelaide said. Obtained in 1879. I'll pursue that tomorrow. Mason had been quiet through most of this meeting. On the walk back to Hannah Briggs' boarding house, he said something that surprised them both. I can advance some of the legal costs, he said, against the eventual recovery from the land case. Adelaide stopped walking. No, it's a loan, not a gift. If the case succeeds, you repay me from the recovered assets. If it fails, we renegotiate. Mr. Sutton. She turned to face him directly. You don't know me. I appeared on your street 6 days ago in tears. I am not in the habit of accepting financial entanglements with strangers. We're not strangers anymore, he said. And then, because he was always direct when it mattered. And I have money that's sitting in a bank earning nothing. If it can be used to break up Gerald Holt's operation, that benefits every rancher in this county, including me. So it's not charity. It's investment in the regional outcome. She stared at him for a long moment. That is a very carefully constructed argument. Yes, he said, it has some genuine merit, she admitted. I know. Another pause. The street was quiet around them, and the evening was coming on, and the light was going amber and long across the boards. I will accept a loan, Adelaide said finally. Documented, written, with specific repayment terms agreed in advance, and I reserve the right to determine those terms to my satisfaction. Of course, Mason said. And I want to be clear, she added, her voice dropping slightly in a way that was not quite a warning but was adjacent to one, that this is a business arrangement. Nothing else. Understood, Mason said. He held her gaze. He did not add anything to this, but he was aware that what he had said was accurate, and also that it was not the whole of what he was thinking. He stored that away the same way she had stored away the personal weight in his voice earlier. They were, without quite naming it, becoming people who held things carefully for each other. The weeks that followed were busy in the way that purposeful work is busy, which is to say that they were difficult and tiring and quietly satisfying in increments. Adelaide secured the temporary teaching position at the school, a one-room building with a drafty roof and 22 students ranging from 6 to 14 years old. She was good at it in the way that people who have clear expectations and genuine patience tend to be good at things. The children, who had been running loose since the previous teacher's departure, adjusted to her within a week and a half with the pragmatic adaptability of children who understand authority when it is honest. She also worked with Farnsworth on the legal case in every hour outside of school, reviewing documents, drafting correspondence, assembling evidence. Tom Ellery came to Caldwell and gave a detailed account to Farnsworth that corroborated and amplified Adelaide's own. Pete Garland sent a written statement, not as a formal deposition but as a private account, which Farnsworth believed would be sufficient for their purposes. Mason came to town every Thursday and sometimes on other days without a stated reason. He began stopping at the school on his way out of town. Adelaide told herself this was because the school was on the road south, and it was simply convenient. She told herself this for approximately 2 weeks before she stopped bothering with the lie. He brought things, not large things or demonstrative things. A book he had finished that he thought she might want to read. A piece of pie wrapped in cloth from the restaurant where he sometimes ate lunch, because she had mentioned once in passing that she rarely had time to sit for a midday meal. A small bundle of dry sage, because she had commented that her room at Hannah's smelled of old wood, and she found the smell of sage on the plains in the morning to be one of the things she missed about the ranch. She kept all of these things. She did not tell him that. One Thursday in late October, he arrived at the boarding house in the early evening and found her on the front porch with a pile of student exercise books that she was marking by lamplight. She was wearing a heavier shawl now that the evenings had turned cold, and she looked up when she heard his boots on the steps with an expression that she had stopped trying to make neutral. "I have news," he said, sitting down in the other porch chair without being asked, which was a measure of how the dynamic between them had settled. Caleb talked to a man who worked for Holt 2 years ago. The man left on bad terms. He's been in Dodge City, but Caleb tracked him down through a mutual contact. Adelaide set down her marking. "What does he know?" "He knows how Holt structures the debt agreements," Mason said. "He was present at several of the signings. He says Holt's standard practice was to have the document notarized by a man named Philip Carey, who was not actually a licensed notary, which means any deed transfer notarized by Carey may have a fundamental legal defect." Adelaide was very still for a moment. "Is the Everett Ranch deed transfer notarized by this Carey?" "Farnsworth is checking tomorrow, but the man Caleb found thinks so. He remembers the Everett name specifically." The look on Adelaide's face in that moment was something Mason knew he would not forget. It was not elation exactly. It was something more precise and more personal than that. It was the expression of a person who has been holding a weight so long that their body has adjusted around it, suddenly seeing a real possibility of setting it down. She pressed her lips together. Her eyes went bright. She looked away from him, down at the exercise books in her lap, and he watched her take 3 slow breaths. "Adelaide," he said quietly. She looked back at him. "You're going to get your land back," he said, and for the second time since they had met she cried. Not the silent, controlled tears of the street in front of the harness shop, but something fuller and more willing. Her hands pressed against her face, her shoulders moving. Mason leaned forward and covered her hands with one of his, and did not say anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying. She pulled her hands away after a moment and straightened again, but she left his hand where it was on hers, which was something neither of them addressed in words. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't usually do this." "I know," he said. "That's why it means something when you do." She looked at him with the full attention she gave to things that mattered. "Mason," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without the Mr. preceding it. "Why are you doing all of this? And I want the real answer, not the one about Gerald Holt and regional benefit." He was quiet long enough that she might have thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, "Because you are the most completely yourself person I have met in a long time, and because I think about you considerably more than is practical. And because I would like, if you would allow it, to be something more than a business associate and occasional carrier of pie." Something in the air between them shifted, very clearly, like a temperature change. Adelaide looked at him for a long, measuring time. "I am not easy to be with," she said. "I have strong opinions about how things should be done. I require honesty above all else. I am independent by nature and by necessity, and I do not intend to give up my independence because of a relationship." "I know," Mason said. "I noticed all of those things about you in the first 10 minutes. And you are not deterred." "I am not deterred." She was quiet for another moment. The lamp between them flickered in the cool evening air. Then she turned her hand over under his so that their palms were together. "Then we will see," she said. It was not a declaration. It was an opening, carefully and deliberately offered by a woman who had learned to be careful about what she gave. Mason pressed her hand once, gently, and then let go, because he understood the gift of what she had offered, and he was not a man who pushed through a door the moment it opened. November came in cold and businesslike. Farnsworth's examination of the deed transfer confirmed that it had been notarized by Philip Carey, whose notary license had lapsed 18 months before he signed the Everett document. Farnsworth filed an application to void the transfer in the district court, citing the defective notarization and attaching the accounts of Tom Ellery and the former Holt employee, whose name was Robert Doss, as supporting evidence. Gerald Holt responded, as anticipated, by hiring an attorney from Wichita, a man named Sims who arrived in Caldwell in a good coat, and with the settled confidence of someone who had won cases by attrition before. He made 2 motions to delay proceedings. Farnsworth countered both. He made an argument that the notarization defect was a technical irregularity insufficient to void an otherwise valid instrument. Farnsworth produced documentation that Kansas law required valid notarization as a condition of deed transfer enforceability, not as a formality. Adelaide was present for every hearing, sitting in the small district courtroom with her hands in her lap, and her face composed in the particular way she had that was not coldness but absolute precision. She listened to the legal arguments with the attention of someone who has made herself knowledgeable about something because she had to, and who resents not having been told these things sooner by the people who should have told her. Mason came to every hearing. He sat in the back row, not beside her, because she had not asked him to sit beside her in that public and formal setting, and he respected the distinction between the private warmth between them and the public story she was telling. But he was there every time, which she knew and which she felt. In the particular way you feel the presence of someone steady when you are doing something hard. Between hearings, they spent time together in ways that were distinct from the legal work. He took her out to see the ranch on a Sunday in early November, driving her in his wagon on a crisp, clear morning. She had not said much on the drive, but she had watched the land with the particular attention of a woman who was born to open space and has been confined without it for too long. When they reached the ranch, she stepped down from the wagon and stood for a moment with her face tilted toward the sky and her eyes closed and the wind moving her dark hair. And Mason watched her and felt something in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. She admired the house with the eye of someone who understood construction, pointing out the quality of the stone foundation, the good alignment of the windows. She spent half an hour with the horses, which told him something important about her, because the horses she was most drawn to were the ones with the most spirit, the ones his hands found difficult to work with, and she handled them with a firm patience that had them dropping their heads and breathing slow inside of 10 minutes. "Where did you learn that?" Mason asked, leaning on the fence rail watching her. "My father," she said, not looking up from where she was running a hand along a chestnut mare's neck. "He said you don't break a horse's spirit, you make an agreement with it. The spirit stays. The horse just agrees to cooperate." She paused. He was right about horses. He was less reliable about business partners. She said the last part without bitterness, but with the resigned honesty of someone who has had time to accept a painful truth. "He sounds like a good man," Mason said. "He was," Adelaide said. "He was a very good man and a mediocre judge of character, and those two things together created most of the problems." She finally looked up at him. "You're a good judge of character. I try to be. You caught Holt's game from a first meeting. Most people didn't." "I grew up watching my father get taken by men like that," Mason said. "It makes you pattern aware." This was the most he had said about his past directly, and she recognized it as such. "Missouri," she said. He looked at her with mild surprise. "You mentioned it once in passing," she said. "When we were walking back from Farnsworth's office the second time. You said back in Missouri and then changed the subject." He was quiet for a moment. The chestnut mare turned her head and nosed at Adelaide's shoulder. "My father was a farmer. He worked himself to nothing on land that never yielded what it should have because the soil was worn out, and he didn't have the money to rest it and replenish it. He borrowed against it twice. The second time, the man he borrowed from was not what he appeared to be, and my father signed papers he didn't fully understand." He paused. "We lost the farm when I was 19. My father died 8 months later. My mother said it was his heart, and it was, but not the medical kind." Adelaide had gone very still. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago," Mason said, "but it's why I built what I have the way I built it. No partners, no loans from private individuals, no paper that I haven't read 3 times, and no agreements with men whose terms are designed to benefit only one side." "That's why you helped me," Adelaide said, "not as an accusation, as understanding." "That's part of why I helped you," Mason said steadily. "The other parts you already know." She looked at him across the fence with the soft, clear expression she wore when she had decided something. She walked over to where he was standing and leaned on the rail beside him, close enough that their arms were touching. "I want to show you something," she said. She reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. "It's a sketch I made of the Everett Ranch, from memory. I've been working on it when I can't sleep." She unfolded it and held it out. It was remarkably detailed. The house, the outbuildings, the tree line along the creek, the particular slope of the south pasture. It was drawn with the accuracy of someone who had grown up with every feature of it imprinted. "It's mine," she said quietly. "I am going to get it back, and I'm going to run it properly. The way my father meant it to be run." "You'll need help," Mason said practically. "I know. I'm not too proud to ask for it when the time comes." She folded the sketch and put it away. "Is the offer still open if I need it?" "The offer never closed," Mason said. They stood there for a while in the November cold, shoulder to shoulder, watching the horses move in the enclosure, and neither of them said anything else about it, but both of them knew something had been agreed. The court ruling came in December. Judge Harold Pratt, of the Kansas 7th District Court, found in favor of Adelaide Everett on the grounds that the deed transfer of the Everett Ranch had been executed with an invalid notarization, rendering it legally void under Kansas state law. He further noted that the presentation of a fraudulent letter, designed to deceive the rightful heir about her legal options, constituted an actionable deception, and referred the matter to the county prosecutor for review of potential criminal charges against Gerald Holt and his associates. Adelaide sat in the courtroom when the ruling was read with her hands folded in her lap, and her face entirely still. When Farnsworth touched her elbow and said softly, "You've won, Miss Everett," she nodded once precisely, the nod of a person receiving confirmation of something they have worked very hard toward. She found Mason in the hallway outside the courtroom. She walked directly to him, and he opened his arms before she reached him, and she walked straight into them and held on, her face against his chest, and this time there were no tears. She was simply still, breathing, absorbing the reality of it. "It's done," he said, his hand at the back of her head. "It's done," she agreed. They stayed like that for a long time in the courthouse hallway, and several people walked past and looked at them and walked on, because this was Caldwell, and people had enough of their own troubles not to stare at someone else's resolution. The return of the Everett Ranch was formalized in the first week of January. Adelaide made the journey to the property with Farnsworth for the official recording of the restored title, and Mason drove her out in his wagon because she had asked him to, and because he would have been there regardless. The ranch was in worse shape than she had left it. Gerald Holt had used it for livestock storage while he held the deed, and the house had been left without proper maintenance through the autumn. 2 windows were broken. The kitchen roof had a soft spot that needed immediate attention. The fencing along the north pasture had not been repaired after the fall winds. The barn roof was sound, at least, and the well was clean. Adelaide stood in the front doorway of her family home and looked at all of it. The cold January light came in through the broken windows and lay in pale rectangles across the floor her mother had laid. The kitchen smelled of disuse and slightly of animals. The ceiling in the front room had a water stain that had not been there before. "It needs work," she said. "Yes," Mason agreed, "a great deal of work. Yes." She turned around and looked at him standing in the doorway behind her. "Are you going to offer to help?" "I was going to give you the space to ask," he said. She almost smiled, which was a thing he had come to love about her, the way a smile from Adelaide Everett arrived as if it had been considered and approved before it was allowed through. "My foreman, Caleb," she said. "Could you spare him for a week to help assess the structural issues?" "I can come myself," Mason said. She looked at him for a moment. "I know you can. I also know you have a ranch to run and cattle to manage. I won't ask you to disrupt your operation for mine." "Then ask me to help as someone who wants to, not as someone you're directing." Another of those considered pauses. "Will you help me assess what needs to be done?" "Yes," he said simply. They spent the afternoon walking the property together, Mason making notes in the small book he carried, Adelaide doing the same in her own hand. They worked in a comfortable parallel, the kind that develops between people who have learned each other's rhythms. When they disagreed about the priority of repairs, which happened twice, they discussed it directly and without heat, and both times arrived at a compromise that was better than either of their original positions. By the time the light began to fail, they had a comprehensive list of what needed to be done, in what order, and what resources would be required. Adelaide was looking at the list with a slight vertical line between her brows that he had come to read as deep concentration. "It's manageable," she said. "In stages. I can be living here by March if I prioritize the house repairs. The teaching position runs through June, which gives me income to fund the work. In the spring, I can start rebuilding the cattle operation." "You've been planning this since before the ruling came down," Mason said. "I've been planning this since before I left Abilene," she said. He shook his head, not in disagreement but in something closer to admiration. "Adelaide, you are a remarkable woman." She turned to look at him, and in the blue winter dusk her face was open in a way he had only seen a few times, the particular openness of a person who has set down something heavy and has not yet picked up the next thing. "Mason," she said quietly, "I want to say something to you, and I want to say it plainly because I do not know another way to say it." He waited. "I have been managing everything alone for a very long time," she said, "and I am very good at it. I intend to keep being good at it. I will always need to be capable of standing on my own." She paused. "But I have also, over the past 4 months, come to understand that there is a difference between relying on someone and choosing to share your life with them. And I find that I want—" She stopped. began again. "I find that I would like very much to share my life with you, if that is still something you want." Mason was quiet long enough that she began, just slightly, to steel herself. Then he crossed the short distance between them and took her face in both of his hands and looked at her with a directness that had no performance in it, no calculation, no hidden layer. "It is," he said. "Entirely. It has been for months." She put her hands over his and closed her eyes briefly, and when she opened them, she was closer to him than she had been. And the distance between them was a matter of inches and intention, and he closed it without hurry and kissed her in the last of the winter light in the doorway of the house that was hers again. It was not a dramatic kiss, in the way of dramatic stories. It was careful and complete, the kiss of two people who have been honest with each other through hard things and know the value of what they are beginning. When they stepped back from each other, Adelaide's composed expression had given way entirely to something unguarded and luminous and holy itself. And Mason Sutton looked at her in the fading light and felt that the 8 years of building something worth keeping had brought him, by a route he could not have predicted, to exactly where he was meant to be. Gerald Holt, as a brief but necessary accounting of consequences, did not escape the fuller weight of what he had done. The county prosecutor opened an investigation in January based on Judge Pratt's referral, and by March, with Robert Doss's testimony and the documentation Farnsworth had assembled, Holt was indicted on 3 counts of deed fraud. Tom Ellery's land was found to have been transferred under similarly defective notarization, and was returned to him that same spring. Holt's Wichita attorney managed to negotiate the charges down through a lengthy process, but Holt was ultimately convicted on 2 counts, fined substantially, and prohibited from conducting any land or property transactions in the state of Kansas. He left the county before the final sentencing and did not return. It was the kind of outcome that was not everything anyone had hoped for, but was more than most people in Holt's position had faced before, and Adelaide, who was practical about justice as about everything else, accepted it as sufficient. The important thing was that it was done. Spring came to the Everett ranch the way springs do in that part of Kansas, not gently but decisively, the grass going from gray-brown to vivid green in what felt like a matter of days, the creek running loud with snowmelt, the sky a particular shade of clear blue that Adelaide had carried in her memory through 2 years in Abilene and 4 months in a boarding house, and all the hard work in between. She moved back to the ranch in March as she had planned, into the house that had been repaired through a combination of her own labor, 2 hired men from town, Mason's help on weekends, and Caleb Wright's assessment expertise. The broken windows were replaced. The kitchen roof was sound. The north pasture fence was rebuilt. She had acquired 6 cattle, a modest start, and 2 horses, one of them a chestnut mare that was not the horse from Mason's ranch, but that reminded her of it. The teaching position ended in June, and she did not renew it, though the school board asked her to consider staying. She thanked them and declined with the particular graciousness of someone who has already decided what comes next. What came next was the last conversation about the future that she and Mason had, the one that answered the question they had been circling since January. He came to the Everett ranch on a Sunday in late June, which he had been doing most Sundays since she moved back, driving over on a morning when neither of them had critical work and spending the day in the useful, companionable way they had developed, working together on whatever needed doing, talking, occasionally arguing about something in the mild, honest way of people who have decided their relationship can bear disagreement. He brought coffee and she made breakfast, which had become a pattern, and they sat on the porch afterward in the early morning coolness watching a hawk work the thermals above the south pasture. "I want to ask you something," Mason said. "All right," Adelaide said. She did not look at him. She was watching the hawk. "Marry me," he said. And then, because he was Mason Sutton and honesty was his habit. "I've been thinking about how to frame this more eloquently for about 3 weeks, and I decided that the most honest thing I can do is say it plainly and let it be what it is. I want to marry you. I want to build something with you. I want to be the person who is here when things are difficult and here when they're not. I love you, Adelaide. I have loved you since somewhere around the 4th Thursday in Caldwell, when you told Farnsworth that the land recording office's refusal to show you public documents was legally incorrect, and you cited the specific statute." Adelaide was very still. The hawk had turned on the thermal and was moving away over the ridge. She was quiet for so long that a lesser man might have begun to reconsider, but Mason had learned her silences, and he knew this one was not hesitation, but the very thorough consideration she gave to things that mattered most. "I want to keep this ranch," she said finally, "under my name or both our names, but I need it to remain mine in some meaningful way." "Of course," Mason said. "The Everett name stays on the deed. We run both operations, yours and mine, separate properties, shared life." She turned to look at him then, fully, with everything open. "You've already thought through all of this. I told you I've been working on it for 3 weeks, and you're not troubled by the arrangement being unusual. I'm not troubled by anything that makes you comfortable staying," he said. She was quiet for another moment. The morning light was full and clear and warm on the porch boards. She set down her coffee cup and turned to face him properly, sitting sideways on the bench, her hands in her lap, her green eyes steady on his face. "I love you," she said, not tentatively. Not as a concession, as a fact, delivered with the same precision she delivered all her most important facts. "I have known it for a while, and I've been taking my time saying it because I wanted to be certain I meant it completely and not partially." "You mean it completely?" Mason asked. "Yes," she said. "Then yes," he said. She took a breath that was slightly uneven at the edges, the specific unevenness of someone feeling something very large. "Yes to what?" "Yes to the fact that I've been waiting for you to say that," he said, "and yes to everything that comes after it." She looked at him for another long moment, and then she leaned forward and kissed him, not with the careful completeness of January in the doorway, but with something fuller and more decided. The kiss of a person who has stopped measuring what they can afford to give. They were married in September of 1883, in the small church outside Caldwell that the Everett family had attended for 20 years. Hannah Briggs came and wept cheerfully from the second pew. James Farnsworth was there in a good dark suit. Tom Ellery, whose land had been returned, and who credited Adelaide's case with making his own recovery possible, attended with his wife and shook Mason's hand with both of his. Caleb Wright stood up with Mason in the capacity of best man, and delivered a toast at the simple celebration afterward that was 4 sentences long and each one of them precisely accurate, which was entirely like him, and which made everyone laugh. Adelaide wore her mother's dress, which she had kept in the trunk that had traveled with her from the Everett Ranch to Abilene to Caldwell and back. It was cream-colored and slightly yellowed and fit her almost perfectly after she made 2 small adjustments. She had thought once or twice that she would not wear it for a very long time, and then she had thought she might not wear it at all, and standing in the small church vestibule waiting to walk to the front, she felt the weight of every person she had lost and every difficult thing she had carried alone in the years before this morning, and she let herself feel all of it briefly and completely, and then she walked in. Mason was standing at the front of the church waiting for her, with the expression of a man who has made the most straightforward decision of his life and is deeply at peace with it. When she came down the narrow aisle, He looked at her with something so direct and uncomplicated that she felt it settle into her chest like warmth. She took his hands when she reached him and looked at him and thought, with the clarity that comes sometimes in large moments, that she had come to Caldwell with $42 and a letter from a lawyer who did not exist, and the particular stubbornness of a person who refuses to stop fighting, and she had gotten her land back and more than she had known to ask for. In the first year of their marriage, they ran their two operations with the same comfortable efficiency they had developed before the wedding. Adelaide managing the Everett ranch with the combination of strategic thinking and physical determination that had defined everything she did. Mason running the Sutton spread 12 miles south and spending 3 to 4 days a week at the Everett place during building and planting seasons. They hired 2 permanent hands for the Everett operation, a pair of brothers named Frank and Samuel Cord from a family who had ranching experience and who, Adelaide had satisfied herself in 2 lengthy conversations, were straightforward and honest. They were not always easy with each other. Adelaide's strong opinions were real and did not diminish with marriage, and Mason's occasional stubbornness about doing things his way even when her way was demonstrably better was a point of friction that surfaced several times in that first year. Each time, they talked it through. Not without heat occasionally, but always fully and always to resolution. Neither of them was the kind of person who allowed things to fester, which was perhaps the most important compatibility between them. In the spring of 1884, Adelaide learned she was expecting a child. She told Mason on a Thursday evening sitting on the Everett ranch porch, directly and without preamble, watching his face as she said it. He was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, and then he crossed the porch and put his arms around her from behind, sitting behind her on the bench, and held her against him for a long time without saying anything at all, which was his way when things were very large. "Are you frightened?" He asked eventually. "No," she said. "I'm practical. There will be a great deal to arrange." A pause. "I may be slightly frightened." "That's reasonable," he said. "So am I, slightly." She turned in his arms to look at him. "We are well suited, you and I know," he said. Their son was born in November of 1884, healthy and vocal and bearing a striking resemblance to Mason around the eyes and to Adelaide around the jaw, which Adelaide noted within the first hour, and Mason agreed was an accurate observation. They named him James Robert Sutton, James for Farnsworth, who had been more than an attorney through the ordeal that brought his parents together, and Robert with a nod to both Mason's father and to the general principle of honoring the people who matter. James Robert proved from early on to have his mother's precision and his father's patience, which was a combination that made him, as he grew, the kind of child who thought something through completely before acting, and then acted with full commitment. He also inherited Adelaide's relationship with horses, going to them with the calm authority that made the most difficult animals cooperative. The Everett ranch grew. By 1886, they had expanded the cattle operation to 120 head, rebuilt the south pasture fencing, added a proper barn to replace the aging original, and dug a second well. Adelaide kept the books in her own hand, with the same exacting accuracy she brought to everything. She also, in 1886, began working informally with Farnsworth on 2 other land fraud cases in the county, not as an attorney, but as someone who understood the practical pattern of how such frauds operated. Farnsworth, who was not a man given to effusive praise, told Mason privately that Adelaide had a legal mind that would have served her well in any courtroom, which was not nothing from a man who had seen a great many legal minds. In 1887, their second child came, a daughter this time, born in July when the grass was at full summer height and the air smelled of wild sage and warm earth. They named her Clara Mee, and she came into the world with a strong pair of lungs and dark eyes that looked at everything with the focused attention that would, as she grew, become her defining characteristic. Where James Robert was methodical, Clara Mee was intensely curious, taking things apart to understand how they worked and sometimes failing to put them entirely back together, a tendency that was familiar to both of her parents from different angles. Mason and Adelaide stood over Clara Mee's cradle on the evening of her third day, the summer twilight coming in long and golden through the windows of the Everett ranch house that was now, without anyone having made a formal announcement, as much Mason's home as his own place 12 miles south. He had his arm around Adelaide's shoulders, and she was leaning against him in the specific way she had developed over their years together of leaning without seeming to lean, the posture of a woman who has learned the difference between dependence and choice. "She has your eyes," Adelaide said. "She has your determination," Mason said. "She's been arguing with the midwife since she arrived." Adelaide almost smiled and then fully smiled, which was still one of the things he loved most, the way a full smile from Adelaide arrived like a declaration. "We have built something here," she said, not with surprise but with the quiet satisfaction of someone saying an accurate thing. "Yes," Mason said. "I used to lie awake in that boarding house room at Hannah's," she said, "in October when we were waiting for Farnsworth's inquiry. I would think about the ranch, about my father, about Daniel. I would try to imagine what came next. I couldn't see further than the legal case. I couldn't see past getting back what we'd lost." She paused. "I couldn't imagine this." "How does it compare to what you couldn't imagine?" he asked. She turned to look at him, there in the golden light above their daughter's cradle. "It exceeds it," she said, "considerably." He pulled her closer, his lips against her temple, and she closed her eyes and felt the full, settled weight of a life that had been fought for and found, built by her own hands and his, on land that had been taken and reclaimed, and was now rooted in something deeper than deed and title, rooted in the particular permanence of people who have chosen each other through enough difficult things to know the choice is sound. The Sutton Ranch and the Everett Ranch operated side by side through the years, becoming in the way of things in the West known locally as the Sutton Everett operations, a pairing that people in the county understood without needing to have it explained. Tom Ellery's spread ran adjacent to them on the north, and they developed the kind of neighboring relationship that was foundational to that part of the country. Shared labor at branding and harvest, the loan of equipment, the casual evening visits that turn over time into the architecture of a life well surrounded. Caleb Wright retired from Mason's operation in 1889 and was replaced by a young foreman named Theodore who had the work ethic and the character to satisfy both Mason and Adelaide's separate and equally exacting assessments. Caleb himself settled in a small house in Caldwell, where he spent his evenings in the satisfying company of a widow named Dolores, who ran the millinery shop, and who had been, everyone agreed, exactly the sort of person Caleb deserved to sit in an armchair across from. James Farnsworth continued practicing law in Caldwell into the next decade, and Adelaide continued her informal collaboration with him on cases that involved the rights of landowners against fraudulent claims. She became, over time, a person that people in the county sought out when they needed to understand their options, not because she was formally licensed to advise them, but because her reputation for accuracy and honest assessment had been established through enough proven outcomes to carry its own authority. She took this work seriously and without payment, because it was not something she could be paid for, and because the satisfaction it gave her was not the kind that required a transaction to be complete. James Robert, at 5 years old, declared with the certainty of someone who has examined the question thoroughly that he intended to ranch, which his parents received with the equal measures of pride and amusement that the announcement deserved. Clara Mee, at 3, maintained a running investigation into the workings of every mechanical object on both properties, and had developed a particular attachment to the horses that matched her mother's, and that manifested in the same calm authority that made even difficult animals cooperative. On an evening in the autumn of 1889, Adelaide and Mason sat on the porch of the Everett ranch house, as they had sat on porches together for 6 years, watching the light go amber over the south pasture where their cattle moved in the long grass. James Robert was inside, being read to by Mason's mother, who had come to live with them the previous year when she could no longer manage the journey from Missouri alone. Clara Mee was asleep, having exhausted herself earlier by attempting to disassemble and reassemble the hinge on the chicken house door, succeeding at the first part more completely than the second. Adelaide had her hands wrapped around a coffee cup and her feet on the porch rail and her hair coming loose from its arrangement in the way it always did by evening, and Mason had his chair pulled close to hers, and his hand resting on the arm of her chair near enough to her hand to be touching without being formal about it, which was how they had always been in the private hours, comfortable and close without requiring ceremony. "It's a good evening," Mason said. "It's an excellent evening," Adelaide agreed, a pause of the kind they had become expert in, the pause between two people who have talked about everything important and now have the particular luxury of silence that means something. "Are you happy?" he asked. Not because he doubted the answer, because he liked to hear her say it. She turned to look at him, and in the amber light her green eyes were soft and certain and holy without the defenses she had worn when he first saw her. All of that precise guardedness opened out over the years into something that was both entirely her and entirely given. "Yes," she said. "Completely." He lifted her hand from the coffee cup and held it between both of his, the way he had once held it on a courthouse landing in January when the legal battle was won, the way he had held it in 1,000 smaller moments that were not dramatic, but that were, in their accumulation, the substance of a life. "So am I," he said. The light faded slowly over the ranch. The cattle settled. The first stars appeared above the ridge line. Inside the house, Mason's mother's voice continued with the story she was reading, and James Robert's questions about it drifted out through the screen door in the small, earnest voice of a child who takes stories seriously, which was a thing both his parents understood. Adelaide leaned her head against Mason's shoulder and he rested his chin on her hair, and they sat there on the porch of the Everett ranch in the Kansas autumn while the evening came on around them, and there was nothing left unfinished between them, nothing held back or unresolved, nothing owed or feared or secret. There was only this, the land that had been reclaimed, the life that had been built, the two people who had come to each other through the particular collision of crisis and character, and had chosen to remain. It was, Adelaide thought in the quiet of that evening, more than she had known to ask for. It was everything that mattered. It was enough and more than enough, and it was theirs.